Hello, my name is Dr. Amanda Butler, and I want to share my research with you, the power of physical contact. This idea will increase your effectiveness as a teacher and will improve your students' academic achievement. My idea was born from the findings of research I conducted back in 2014. These findings were unexpected, but have been the impetus for my later research. Before I share my research with you, I need to give you some background information on myself. This is my family. I'm the one on the right. I was lucky growing up. I had a mother and father who loved me, cared for me, and would watch Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and Sesame Street with me. I had a fairly typical rebellious teenage career, but I got my act together and went to college. I became a classroom teacher and a reading interventionist. As a reading interventionist, I worked with some of the lowest children I have ever worked with still to this day. Many of the students did not have the upbringing I had, and I didn't understand how these types of activities and families could shape one's learning. This prompted me to get my doctorate in reading education. As I conducted my research for my dissertation, I learned of a boy named Luke. Luke's upbringing was not like mine. Luke was a kindergartner who had been removed from his home. He was living with his aunt and his uncle, who were under investigation from the Department of Children and Family Services. He was combative with his peers and his teacher, and he did not want to be touched. He was below benchmark on all beginning of year and middle of year assessments. Luke was placed with a veteran teacher who was also Teacher of the Year. She was highly effective, so why was Luke failing? While Luke was a participant in my research, he received side-by-side interactive read aloud 3 times a week for 8 weeks. What that means is that the teacher sat on the floor with him and read to him and shared a book. By week 2 of this intervention, Luke was snuggling into the teacher's side and had put his hand in her lap. He began getting in trouble less, and he began being more cooperative with his peers and his teacher. By the end of the study, Luke benchmarked on all end-of-the-year reading assessments. Luke's story has a fairy tale ending. In just 8 weeks, he went from underperforming to outperforming his peers. He literally needed love, and he maintained this growth years later. I ran into him in second grade and found out from his teachers that he had been placed in all advanced classes. If you're skeptical about this information, let's look at scientific research. Prior to the research study, Luke was experiencing a release of high levels of cortisol daily or almost daily. Cortisol is released during times of stress. It's released during distress or ecological risk factors such as repeated stressful occurrences, traumatic events from parents or caregivers, and unstable housing conditions or poverty. Cortisol binds itself to the amygdala and the hypothalamus, which influences memory. It also fuels fight or flight instincts. This is what cortisol looks like on Luke's brain. Luke was physiologically incapable of retaining what he was learning. He did not have the mental reserves available to remember new information. Oxytocin can offset cortisol. Oxytocin originates in the hypothalamus and then expands to the pituitary glands and regions of the spinal cord. It frees up that mental space. It counteracts the cortisol levels, and it strengthens relationships and promotes pro-social behaviors, including trust, cooperation, empathy, attachment, and increased generosity. It can be released during physical touching. When physical touching occurs, oxytocin is released. When oxytocin is released, feelings of safety, feeling cared for, feeling motivated, and a reduction of stress are the effects of that. And in turn, then the mental reserves open up. They have the individual will have improved concentration and will have improved relationships. Overall, they will improve in their academic achievement. There's been a few studies done on oxytocin. These are some of my favorites. Oxytocin has been studied since the 1970s in terms of being released via touch. Back in the 70s, there was a study called Touching Hands of Strangers, where college students, when they went to the library and they would check out a card, they would hand the librarian their card, and the librarian would touch their hand for 1 second or less in the exchange. And those who had their hands touched viewed the librarians more favorably than those that didn't have their hands touched. In a different study, 294 NBA players were studied across 30 teams. And in this study, those players who made physical contact with one another, which would include fist bumps, chest bumps, leaping shoulder bumps, head slaps, and high fives, outperformed those who did not make physical contact. Predictions of individual performance could be determined by frequency of physical contact, and overall team performance could also be predicted. There was a few other studies done where oxytocin was released via a nasal spray. There was no touching, but this still highlights the positive outcomes of releasing oxytocin. Male college students inhaled oxytocin intranasally and played the role of investor. 80% of those who inhaled the oxytocin were more generous with their trustees. An earlier study where individuals inhaled oxytocin were asked to split a sum of money with a stranger, and those who inhaled the oxytocin were more generous. So clearly, when oxytocin is released, our brain flips a switch and makes us more trusting, generous, and kinder people. It also makes us feel more positive towards one another. So how can you apply this in your classroom? Depending on the grade level you teach, it will look differently. You can make physical contact with students throughout the day, every day, through high fives, fist bumps. You can place a hand on their shoulder or even hold hands with your young line leader. You can engage in small group physical contact during read-alouds, such as the one that Luke was in. You can also recruit humans over computer programs. Recruit your parents or your grandparent volunteers or college students to come in and work with your students. Also, know your families, like really know your families. Your students will notice this and will feel safer at school because of it. Students' emotional needs are not in the standards, but they have to be met in order for students to learn. But don't take my word for it. Get out there and try it yourself. See what a difference it makes. If you try this and you get a fairy tale ending like I did, please reach out to me and share your story. I may be able to include you in an upcoming publication. Thank you for listening to this inspiring story of Luke and for allowing me to share my research ideas with you.